Apologies that we can't be running this in person, but as you understand, the university is cautious about opening up again. So welcome to everyone online. And following on from the talk from Tim Rose, this week we're very pleased to have Matthew Trewhella from Kensa. And Matt's going to be updating us on some field information about ground source heat pumps, so drawing on the local trials forming part of Energy Superhub, but then talking more about what that could mean for decarbonising heat in the UK. We're interested to understand Kensa's view of the decarbonisation of existing buildings and also something of the value attached to smart controls with the heat pump systems. So I've just been looking. Matt started out in Cardiff, close to my hometown, and I gather early in his career, Matt pursued an interest in dust and vacuum, and I was wondering whether that was through domestic science, Matt, but no, it's astrophysics at Caltech, looking at interstellar dust in galaxies beyond the Milky Way, again, a subject close to my heart. But back for this evening's seminar, Matt's extensive hands-on experience through not only his own design and installation business, which was integrating solar thermal, PV with wind, biomass, and both air and ground source heat pumps, but also with heating and hot water systems. So I'd say, Matt, you've got a lot of the experience of how these things work in practice rather than what the design manual tells us they should do. So Matt is currently Managing Director of Kensa Contracting, and he's overseen the development of large-scale installations and helping to blaze the trail for ambient shared ground loops. And I'm hoping we'll hear more about that, including something about comfort and cost for those cold periods in the winter we currently experience. So Matt, we very much look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Robin. And yeah, it was an interesting transition from world of academia and thinking about how things work to crawling around on roofs, fixing solar panels to them and through lofts and learning how plumbing systems work. So hopefully it should give you a nice blend of the theoretical and the practical tonight. So I do have a few slides which I will share and take you through this presentation.
So fine, thank you very much, Matt.
Good, perfect. So yeah, we'll do a little bit of introduction. Robin's already given you a bit of background on me, but I'll also introduce you to Kensa. A little bit of how ground source heat pumps work, and apologies for those who already know it, but it's useful to get those basics in place before you can start thinking about the variations and some of the state-of-the-art stuff we're doing, and some of the places we're not doing some yet, but hopefully we'll be doing in the not too distant future. So we'll go through those shared ground arrays. Networked heat pumps is the direction we think heat pumps are going to go, or should go, or could go if Kensa's view of it gets picked up, and that's enabled by something called split ownership, which is a concept we'll take you through, and then we'll have a look at specifically what we're doing in Oxford. Hopefully that will all feed together into a good picture of how we see the world according to heat pumps and the decarbonisation of heat more generally. And then we should have time for some questions at the end. So that's a little bit of me. As Robin said, my background's in astrophysics, which I studied for around 10 years. For astronomers particularly, the concept of climate change is pretty well known. Clearly remember one of my undergraduate tasks being to calculate the temperature we would expect the Earth to be based on just the temperature of the sun, how big it is and how far away it is and how large the Earth is. And surprise, surprise, it's actually warmer than you expect it to be by the pure calculations. And the difference is the temperature increase due to the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. So that stuff is second nature. We have to study how climate change is enacted on Venus, and it just seemed completely obvious that CO2 would lead to that. And obviously, it's a very good thing because it's enabled life on Earth, having those warmer temperatures. It's enabled the rich diversity that we see, just a little bit too much of it at the moment. So I got very concerned about climate change in the late 90s, and went from worrying about it to worrying about it quite a lot to deciding that I shouldn't be spending my life attached to the end of a telescope and getting a lovely privileged lifestyle of studying how energy transports through galaxies. What I should be doing is devoting my life towards fighting climate change. And in 2000, I moved back to the UK, and that's what I've been doing ever since. So, as I said, I've had experience in all sorts of renewable technologies, but the last 8.5 years have been specifically for ground source heat pumps and ground source alone with the Kensa. So Kensa itself, we're a group of a few companies, which does sound a little bit grander than it is, but we've separated out the functions, so each into our own specialism. The original company is Kensa Heat Pumps, and that was founded in 1999 and is to this date the UK's largest supplier of ground source heat pumps, with somewhere between 40 and 50% of the heat pumps, ground source heat pumps fitted in the UK, would have been built at our factory near Trewhella in Cornwall. And around 2013, Kensa decided that we needed to get a little bit more involved in particularly some of the larger projects, and particularly around social housing. They won a project to install 200 heat pumps for a housing association in Somerset, and that's the idea of Kensa contracting was born out of that. So we'll look at anywhere you can do a lot of ground source in one place. So that could be a very large building like a leisure centre or a school or a hospital, but it could also be 100 flats. So it could be 100 tiny buildings, you're essentially doing it all at the same place. And it equally could be new build. So that's our three sectors that we work in: is non-domestic buildings, new build, and social housing retrofit. So social housing has the great advantage that they own all the properties in a street or a tower block. So you can get a decision to treat them all at the same time. That's important for ground source because economies of scale really do matter when it comes to putting things in the ground, particularly. And it's very, very time consuming to do them one property at a time, but doing 100 properties at a time is far less expensive, particularly if those properties are very similar to each other. You get a lot of repeated design. And then the third company within the group is a much newer one. You describe it as almost fledgling. It's only really in the last 12 months started running some live projects. And the idea of Kensa Utilities is to fund, own, and operate these shared infrastructures that we're going to learn a little bit more about in the next 10 to 15 minutes. So that's early stages. It's just got its first project underway at the moment, which is in Cornwall, which is an ERDF funded project we're calling Heat the Streets. And hopefully they'll be channeling more investment into that company and funding and setting up our vision for the split ownership. Okay, so that's a little bit around heat pumps. How does it actually work? I'm not going to spend ages and ages going through the details of how a ground source heat pump works. There is a link there to our website, which takes you through in a lot of detail. But we'll just cover a little bit of the basics and some of the things you'll need for the rest of the presentation to make sense. So the heart of this system is a refrigeration circuit, and it's a fairly bulk standard refrigeration circuit. So exactly the same as would be in your fridge or freezer, but just the components are optimized for heating. And the refrigerant circuit, for those, I'm sure quite a few on the call will already know, but for those that don't, the easiest place to think of it starting is here, if you can see my cursor on the screen, looking at the top middle, which is the compressor. And that takes gas and squeezes it to increase the pressure quite dramatically. And as you do that, the temperature rises. So you press the gas, the hot compressed gas then comes through into a heat exchanger where we take some heat out of it, send it off to the heating system or the hot water. And this heat exchanger is just a series of plates connected to each other. So it goes gas, liquid, gas, liquid, gas, liquid, and the liquid pumps off to the heating system, taking heat out of that gas. As it comes out of that heat exchanger, then you have a restriction. It's called an expansion valve. Sometimes you hear it called a throttle, and it basically stops the progress of that gas through. So the combination of taking some heat out of the gas and restricting it passing through this expansion valve causes the pressure to build up, and it turns from a gas back into a liquid, and then it's allowed to pass through this side. And probably shown as a liquid here, but it's probably already starting to be a mixture of a liquid and a gas. And then it comes into another heat exchanger. This one's connected to the ground, and as it's coming into this heat exchanger, it's well below zero, even as low as -30 on certain circumstances, and therefore the temperature coming in from the ground, it feels quite warm to this liquid. That combined with the lower pressure from the compressor drawing this gas through here causes it to boil back into this heat exchanger and then head back into the compressor to be recompressed and reheated. And the gas basically just goes round and round and round this circuit. What that effectively does is take heat from this right-hand side, as we see it here, the cold side, and drop it onto the left-hand side, the hot side. So you're moving heat, but you're also changing the temperature range. So you'll be coming in from the ground anywhere between 0 and 10 degrees. You're heading out to your heating system, 45, 50, 55 Celsius, and you're upgrading the heat as well as moving it. Now, this refrigeration circuit does take electricity. As you know at home, you have to plug your fridge in to keep your food cold. So it does take electricity to drive this system. The compressor is the biggest consumer of energy within the system. But the really cool thing is the energy taken to drive it is less than the heat that you get out of the end. So in a very, very simple ground source system, for every 4 units of heat that you deliver into the heating system, 3 of them would have come from the ground, 1 of them would have come from the electricity supply. So all of that electricity used to drive that system ends up being recaptured as heat. So you're delivering 4 into here, 3 from the ground, 1 from the electric supply. So if you were to compare that in terms of standard efficiency, so if you think of a gas boiler, for instance, if you're doing really well, every 1 unit of gas that you put in, you'll get sort of 0.9 units of heat energy coming out. So you'd call that 90% efficiency. So on the same scale, ground source heat pump would be 400% efficient. Now they do range depending on what you're trying to heat, what heat pump it is. So it's really somewhere between 300 and 400% typically. As a scientist, having percentages more than 100 can be a bit confusing at times. So they quite often call it a coefficient of performance. That's just the heat out divided by the electricity consumption. So your COP, coefficient of performance, would be between 3 and 4. The ground then is gradually recharged over time. And what you'll normally see in a ground source heat pump system is the temperature dropping slowly through the winter as you extract it out of the ground and using it for heating and hot water. And then during the summer, although you're doing hot water, you normally size a system so that the ground is actually recovering all summer long. And then you just get into this annual cycle of cooling down gradually over the winter and reheating back over the summer. And it's actually diffuse solar energy that's going into it. So a lot of people will mix up ground source heat pumps technology with geothermal, and in America they actually call it geothermal, what we would call ground source. In the UK, the definition is if you're taking the heat from deeper than 500 meters, then it's typically called geothermal. Shallower than that is called ground source. This is how we, most people think of ground source heat pump. And if we're talking to government, we're talking to lots of advisors, this is what they're picturing when they talk about heat pump deployment and ground source, how it would be deployed in the UK. And for most of Kensa's history, this is exactly how it happened. So you have one property, you have one heat pump in the property, in the garage or utility or an outbuilding, and then you've got one ground array. Now you can see here there's more than one loop of pipe, but it all essentially gets combined together before it goes into the heat pump. And then that's what's used to provide the heating and hot water. It's very well suited to self-build. This is actually cheaper and easier to do when you're putting the system in rather than trying to retrofit. It's often when you out in the countryside, so you haven't got access to the mains gas. So for the longest time, and still to a certain extent, mains gas is the cheapest way to to heat a property. It's not low carbon, and it's not necessarily healthy, but gas is still very cheap. It's still considered one of the cheapest ways of heating a building. And if you're out of the country, you've got access to a lot more space. So if you're putting in ground collectors, you've got space to do that. So that's the long history of ground source and Kensa from 99 right up until sort of 2012, 2013. All of the systems were deployed that way. And to be fair, it's still quite a popular way of doing it now. However, it's been overtaken in the last few years by something called a shared ground loop array. And this is where you have a group of collectors, and it doesn't really matter whether that's boreholes or whether it's slinkies or straight pipe or whether it's taking water from a lake or an underground aquifer. There's loads and loads of different ways of getting heat into the network. But the key point is whatever way you choose to collect the energy, ultimately, that's then shared between multiple heat pumps in multiple buildings. Okay, so you can see this example here has 4 properties, each with their own heat pump and connected to 5 boreholes. When we're doing this in tower blocks, you can sometimes have between 4 and 6 flats per borehole, and they're normally grouped up. So you quite often see a system with 25, 26 flats connected to 5 or 6 boreholes. And it's quite a different way of thinking about it, and there are a lot of advantages. You can scale it up, or you can do it as small as 2 properties. I've got a system like this in my own house. So my father lived next door, and I've got a field at the back which had a lot of solar in it, and I put very cheap collectors into the field, brought them in, split it off to my house, took it off to Dad's. We have our own heat pump, and that's it. I've got a shared ground array with just 2 properties. Equally, we've got it with hundreds of flats when we're decarbonising tower blocks at a time. So it's a very, very flexible system. One of the really cool things about it is the heat pumps themselves are connected to the property's own electricity system. So they're just wired into your house like any other appliance. And that means if you whack the thermostat up and open the windows, I don't know why you do that, but if you did that, you would then pay more to run the heat pump. So although it's efficient, for every unit of heat you want delivered into the house, you are buying a third to a quarter of that in electricity. So your bill would just go up, and you pay for it in the natural way. You're also then taking heat from the ground. The circulating pump inside the heat pump is what circulates through the ground. So the shared bit is completely passive. There's nothing in here. You don't need a plant room. You don't need a big pumping station. You're automatically self-balancing. So if one house turns on, one small pump turns on, and it moves around the system quite slowly. If 2 houses turn on, then another pump turns on, and it speeds up going through the shared ground array. So there's very, very little kind of electronic or controls or shared. There's no cost to divide up amongst the neighbours. Once the system's in, it's just purely a capital investment, fit the ground array, and then the system just runs in its own way. Although this is actually a type of district heating, if you think about it, a district heating might have a central plant, CHP powered by gas or whatever the main source is, sending heat round at 60 to 70 degrees, and then you take that heat off in each building. Here we are actually sending heat around. So although it's only up to 10 Celsius, we are actually sending heat around the district. And as we looked on the schematic for the heat pump itself, 3/4 or at least 2/3 of the energy that comes out to the heating system has come from the ground. So it is a district heating system here. Sometimes difficult to persuade people that it's a district heating system because you get what you picture when you first think of that, but that's what it is technically. In terms of understanding how it fits together and business models and billing, it's actually far easier to think of it as a traditional gas framework. So you've got, in a gas system, you've got a pipe carrying a low-grade energy, as in a chemical energy in the form of gas, to your a white box is the pipe. A white box then converts that into usable heat, and you pay for the that it goes into the building. So this is a very similar concept, really, from a financial and business point of view. There's loads of benefits there, including very, very efficient. So if you're doing the traditional district scheme, you'll be losing heat every time you send it around the neighbourhood. But here, the temperatures we're flowing the liquid in are at roughly the same temperature as the ground, if not slightly below. So a lot of the times you're actually gaining heat while you're sending it around the district, and you're only upgrading to useful temperatures once you're inside the thermal envelope of the building. So a lot of district schemes can actually be, unfortunately, a little bit of inefficient, because a lot of the energy they send out of the central plant can get used up by just heating corridors and the like, and the ground, and you have to put quite expensive insulation on it. So whereas the pipework we use here doesn't even need any insulation at all, because it's actually gaining as it moves around. And because of that efficiency, you actually end up with very low running costs. Okay, so that's what we're doing now. This represents 95%, maybe even more, of Kensa Contracting's work, and over 80% of Kensa's work as a whole. So 4 out of every 5 heat pumps that come out of the factory will end up connected to a shared ground loop array, and we've demonstrated this concept now over several thousand properties, from tower blocks to streets. And if you think about it, a street is just a tower block on its side, or a tower block is just a street on its side, whichever your preference. And we've got systems with hundreds of properties connected to it. And our biggest program to date was around 1,000 properties across Yorkshire for a housing association called Together Housing, and that ran over 3 years. That split up into quite a lot of separate shared ground arrays. There was around 70 miles from one side to the other. So what we were able to do was create mini district schemes in each location, but we had a whole program to run up. And I think the most we've had on a single site is around 400 flats. So you can scale it up and down how you like. And in new build, it's great because you can either connect a whole site. We've got sites where people are building 300 or 400 homes, but actually they don't particularly want all of that infrastructure in place at day one before they build it out. What they'd like to do is build 50 to 100 homes, sell them, get the cash in, and then fund the infrastructure on the next one. So you can scale the shared ground array up or down depending on how you're building that site out. So lots of flexibility, lots of advantages. This is what it looks like in a set of flats. This schematic here, you can see this flat sharing a ground array there on the right, and then inside the flat we've got a special type of heat pump that we developed at Kensa called a shoebox. We've got 2 sizes of those, and they were developed specifically to connect to shared ground arrays. In theory, you can connect any size heat pump you want to that concept. It doesn't really matter. But the shoebox, because they're very small, then they fit into flats. So they're very well suited for shared ground arrays. And that's what we set them up. So you can see here on the left, that's a shoebox in what used to be the gas meter cupboard. And then where the gas combi boiler was, we've got the hot water storage. In this case, we used a type of hot water storage called a phase change thermal store, manufactured by a company called Sunamp in Scotland. And that is also designed to fit a lot of hot water into a small space. So you've got a heat pump that's been shrunk and a hot water storage that's been shrunk, and that enabled this project to go ahead. You can connect the heat pumps to any hot water tanks, but we think this pairing has got particular benefits for especially in flats where space is limited. That's what it looks like. So where are we going in the future? We're going to push from shared ground arrays to networked heat pumps. And a lot of it is exactly the same. So the core of it is a network of pipes, property, each building, each heat pump, that are sending heat around the district at low grade, at what we call ambient temperatures, which we're defining as anything between 0 and 20. You could probably stretch it to from -5 to +25, full range. And the key when you're sending temperatures, heat around the district at those temperatures, is that you're not losing it. So because it's ambient, because it's in sync with the ground that it's touching, you're not losing energy when you're sending it around. You're only upgrading it inside the building. So you have an individual heat pump with each property, and that could be a huge heat pump for a supermarket. It could be supermarket cooling, offices, or it could be down to a tiny flat, as we saw in the previous example, which was just a 3 kilowatt heat pump. And each heat pump that's connected to it is tailored for the building. So a lot of the issues you have with district heating is connecting to a mismatch of different buildings. You've got to run the whole system at the temperature needed for the worst performing building. Whereas if you move the heat pump out to each building, you might have one building that you just have to accept running at 60, 70 degrees, and then building next door, you might be able to upgrade the thermal efficiency of the fabric, or you might be able to upgrade the radiators and run at 45 to 50 degrees. So you're actually just optimizing for each building as you go along. The heat pumps can also provide cooling. So if you think of it, the picture we saw at the beginning was moving heat from one side of the heat pump to the other. But actually, if you think about it, that right-hand side, as we looked at it, the cold side is creating cold on that side, which we're then pumping away to the ground, and you're creating heat on the other side. So the cold is always a waste product of the heat, and the heat is always a waste product of the cold. So if you use a networked heat pump for cooling, then you're taking the waste product of everybody making their heating and hot water and using that as your input for your cooling. And the waste product for cooling, you're putting into the network and using that as your input for heating. So you can get this system where you're recapturing all of those elements. If you use something like a traditional air conditioning, you take heat out of a building and you blow it into the air. Unfortunately, that air is already warm, and in cities, you're spiking during the summer, and then you're trying to cool, and you're actually making the system worse because you're putting that heat energy that you've extracted out of your building into the air right next to the buildings you're trying to cool. Whereas with a ground connected and particularly network system, you put them into the ground, and if you've got boreholes, then they're locked away there, and you're going to get some interseasonal storage between heating and cooling. That ground takes a very long time to heat up and cool down. As you recall, a traditional straight ground source system is gradually cooling all winter and gradually warming up all summer. When you're doing a mixed heating and cooling system, then that's probably still true, but the temperature range that you're going through is higher. So your heating becomes much more efficient in the winter because you're starting off possibly 12, 14, 15, 16 degrees rather than the 6 to 8 degrees that you normally get out of a ground source system. And in the summer, you're getting far more efficient as well, because you might be trying to take your cooling from air that's 25 or 30 degrees, whereas if you use a network heat pump to do it, you're taking it from the ground that's 10 to 15 degrees. So you get efficiency improvements on both sides. Your COP in a network system can easily reach 5 or 6 without doing any innovation with a heat pump. So at Kensa, we do have an R&D department, and they're always tinkering with the heat pumps. And you can get 1% here, you can get another 0.5% there, but really, we don't see vast improvements in the actual heat pumps themselves because they're already getting to the point where they're limited by the physical properties of the expansion and contraction of the gas rather than how you're hooking the heat pump together. But very easily, by networking the heat pumps in this way, you can get a big leap forward in the efficiency of the system. One special case of cooling that we think has got a huge benefit and huge potential for the UK as a whole is cooling of solar PV panels. Solar PV panels actually perform better when they're cold. So they're normally rated at around 25 degrees C, and as the temperature increases above 25, the output of the panel drops. And I've got PV panels at home, and you can feel them in the summer. They're 35, 40 degrees. You can put your hand behind the back of the panel, and I'm losing around 6 to 8% output from my panels because they're getting warm. If we connect them to the ground, actually, we've just spent all winter taking heat out of the ground that started at maybe 10 degrees and ends up at around 2. And if we circulate that 2-degree water over the back of the PV panels, you can chill them right down well below the rating temperature, well below 20 degrees. And you can actually get quite a huge boost in output from your PV panels. The waste of your boosting the PV panels is fed back into the ground, and that accelerates the recharge. And you could end up with a situation by the end of the summer, instead of getting your ground recovering back up to around the 10 degrees it was originally, you could have it boosted all the way up to 20 degrees. And then in the winter, when you take heat out, it will probably drop to 10 to 12. So you're just increasing the average temperature of the ground by anything between 5 and 10 Celsius, which has a huge impact on the efficiency of the heat pump. You could, of course, choose to install less ground array, so you could make your boreholes shorter and therefore cheaper, and bring down the capital cost. So yeah, it would be down to each project then whether you take the improved efficiency or the reduced capital cost, or more likely we think a combination of the two. We've got a couple of animations. I've put some links in the slides that you'll have shared later to show how this system works, and I'd encourage you to go and have a look at those afterwards. So the first one is an animation we put together, and this a networked heat pump and show you how you decarbonise that street. Of course, there are green streets in cities all over the UK, and what we put together for Glasgow, slightly tongue-in-cheek, could be replicated anywhere across the UK.
Matt,
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but we lost a bit of your communication there. Could you go back about, say, 2 minutes? It got stuck. We didn't hear what you said.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Were we talking about? Was it talking about the PVT, the cooling of the PV panels?
Yes.
A good place
I think it's a good place to just recap. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, not sure exactly how far you got, but we think a useful case for cooling using networked heat pumps is the cooling of solar photovoltaic panels. They like to run at low temperatures, and if we spend all winter taking heat out of the ground, taking it from its ambient temperature of around 10, 11, 12 degrees down to a few degrees, maybe 2 degrees, we can then pump that water over the back of the PV panels, chill them. The PV panels give quite a lot of extra energy out, potentially 10 to 15% extra energy through the course of a summer. And the heat that we've taken out of those PV panels goes into the ground, accelerates the recharge that we would normally have naturally from the ground, and could even take that to higher than the ground started originally. And we expect to be able to take up to around 20 Celsius using cooling of PV panels. So instead of starting the heating season at around 10 and finishing at around 2, we could be starting around 20 and finishing around 12. So adding, potentially 10 degrees, but at least 5 degrees to the average temperature that the heat pump sees, and that will reduce the electricity consumption of the compressor, improve the efficiency, and reduce the cost of running heating for anyone whose buildings have that connected. So we think it's a lovely complementary technology where you get more electricity out during the summer and less electricity consumption in the winter. We have a couple of animations there. I've put links to it that you'll get in the slides that we send through. The first one is showing how different energy systems hook together, and how the ambient network interacts with the electricity grid, with vehicle charging, with heating and cooling, and all of those things work together. And then we've got our green street augmented reality, so you can download the app on your phone and project Green Street onto your desk. Green Street is a real street. It's in Glasgow, and it is just 2 miles away from where they held the COP26 conference. So slightly tongue-in-cheek, we put together a campaign ready for last November that showed how we would take Green Street off mains gas heating, which it currently is, onto a low-carbon heating system. And obviously there's green streets all over in cities across the UK, and pretty much any street could become a green street, if not called Green Street, using this technology. Hopefully between the two runs there, slightly different each time, you'll got a good idea of what we're trying to do there. The thing that we expect to enable this concept of networked heat pumps is something that we're calling split ownership. And that's where you deploy the infrastructure in the street like you would a utility. So winding the clock back 100 years, when town gas was rolled out across the UK in the major cities, an investor would come along, put the pipework into the street, and then properties would connect as and when they either got jealous of their neighbours or wanted initially gas for lighting, and then later in the 60s and 70s, gas central heating was connected to those networks. So it wasn't a case where you had to persuade a few thousand homes to connect and switch over in one go. You put the infrastructure in, and then you put your white box, which we all know as a gas boiler, but you put your white box, your energy converter and upgrader into your home as and when you're ready for it. We think that's the best way to deploy heat pumps, and particularly in our high density cities. So if you're picturing your Coronation Street style streets where you've got lots and lots of rows and terraces, very difficult to see how you're going to get a traditional ground source or an air source heat pump into those properties. But if we came along and put boreholes up in the street, use the streets themselves as both the source of heat and the way we distribute the energy, and then you can just see 2 pipes coming up to your front gate with a connection to your district. Then when you come to replace your gas boiler, actually it's a fairly straightforward thing to do. You buy a slightly different white box, your plumber connects the 2 pipes coming in from the street to it, and the other 2 pipes off to your heating system, and there you go, you've decarbonised that property. At the moment, it would take quite a lot of commitment. If you're a homeowner and you think, oh, my oil boiler or my gas boiler is defunct, or I want to reduce my carbon footprint, you have to be quite committed, because you have to learn about how the heat pump works. If you're going with ground source, you then got to find space to put it in your garden, somewhere to drill a borehole or put a horizontal collector in. You then got to get a different person to come in and fit the heat pump. Somebody's got to design it all. We do that at Kensa, and we've got a whole team based at our sales and technical office in Exeter that help people do that. But it is a fair commitment. You've got to basically design the system right from scratch for property by property. And if you think about it, a gas fitter doesn't really have to do that. Very few gas engineers understand how district gas pipework works, but they don't have to. All they need to know is when they plug this pipe into their gas boiler, when the gas boiler is running, it maintains a minimum pressure to keep the boiler running, and therefore the network must be doing its thing. They don't really have to get involved. And we think the same should apply to heat pump deployment on the mass scale. We should use specialists like Kensa Contracting, but lots of others to come in and do the design, put the systems into the street, and then the householders have actually got quite a lot of choice. They can choose their favourite plumber, they can choose their favourite heat pump brand, and they can choose their favourite electricity supplier once it's connected. So you maintain quite a lot of consumer choice within this concept. The infrastructure is put in like a utility. The other thing, bringing in a infrastructure in a utility style, is it brings in people with large amounts of cash to invest. So utilities, that's what they've done for hundreds of years, is invest in infrastructure and then bring customers to their system. We expect the cost of putting this in the street to be recovered by something that's far more like the gas standing charge than anything else. So the infrastructure is in the street, somebody connects to it, and then you just pay that utility for access to their ground array, their ambient loop, which ideally has a combination of ground source with waste heat recovery, with cooling of various different types. And we think that's the way forward for the mass decarbonisation, particularly in those cities. You can bring in lots of incentives and you can layer those on top of each other. So reasons for connecting to the network could be your boiler is broken down. At the moment, if your gas boiler is broken down, you really want your heating back on within a few days, and planning a major switch to a low carbon heating system is pretty much out of the question. We think that would be possible in this case. You could also, a good trigger is when you buy a property. So a lot of people will upgrade a property and do various other cosmetic works, or sometimes a bit more than cosmetic works, and upgrading the heating would be a great time to do that. You can get local incentives, so there could be grants at the moment. You get grants from the government for fitting heat pumps, but it could also be linked to things like stamp duty. So the stamp duty on buying a new property could be linked to its carbon intensity. So there'd be an incentive then. You could even say if you switch the heating over within a certain amount of time, then you get a rebate on your stamp duty when buying the property. Council tax. There are already lenders that I've been speaking to that are bringing out green mortgages, where you actually will pay a lower interest rate for a lower carbon property, and if you've got low carbon heating system. And then at some point, we are going to have to wean ourselves fully off gas. So if you know in your area, the gas has got 8 more years, at least you've got a time to plan and manage that switch over to a low carbon heating system and your and your networked heat pump. So there's lots of different ways of triggering this, and we think all of those things can layer on top of each other. Bringing in large scale investment is a key to unlocking it. I speak a lot to institutions that want to invest in low carbon anything, low carbon tech, as they think about it. The interest in heat is intense at the moment, but nearly all of those large institutions start their investment at around £100 million, and they want to know how it's going to scale up quickly from that. So if you added up the whole of the UK ground source market every year, it wouldn't even make it to the starting gate at the moment in terms of size for these large institutions. But if we start moving towards this networked heat pump and the split ownership, they can see how, when you start doing it postcode areas at a time, or streets at a time, or towns at a time, or city areas at a time, they can get to the sort of amounts of investment that they consider starting. I wouldn't quite say they wouldn't get out of bed for less than £100 million, but that's pretty much the message that you get across. So that's where we see kind of a ground source past, present, and future. So shame we're a few weeks after Christmas. That would have been a nice link to A Christmas Carol, but lots of opportunity for ghosts of ground source past, present, and future going in there. But that's that. What are we doing in Oxford specifically? And the project we're working on is part of the Energy Superhub Oxford, and I think Tim gave you a good overview of that. But as a quick refresher, this heat is part of that larger demonstration, and it's looking at local energy systems, so particularly the electricity system for balancing the grid, electrification, in this case of transport, and electrification of heat via ground source heat pumps, and it's in the Oxford area. The heat side of things is down on the Blackbird Lees estate, southeast Oxford, and we have turns out not only do they own these properties in Oxford, not only we're familiar with ground source.
Again, Matt, because we lost you there. Can you go back about 1 minute or so? If you were talking,
yeah, sure.
We lost you again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I wasn't just sitting silently, so yeah, it's probably just a bit of an internet connection drop. So yeah, just a refresh of what we're doing specifically in Oxford. So the Energy Superhub Oxford is looking at balancing electricity through batteries and through electrification of transport and electrification of heat. We've got a site in the Blackbird Leys estate in South East Oxford, which is owned by Stonewater Housing Association and has 60 properties in this project. And Stonewater is someone we've worked heating upgraded anyway, really all tied together quite nicely. We put in a shared ground array system using boreholes, and this is a Google Earth shot showing the schematic and the location. So each of these purpley pinky spots is a borehole of around 90 to 100 meters deep, and you've got an array here, 1, 2, 3, connected into a manifold that's feeding these properties flats here, another 1, 2, 3 feeding these flats, 1, 2, 3 there. So there's 3 separate shared ground arrays feeding around, I think in this case is 12 flats. The different thing we're doing in Energy Superhub Oxford and Blackbird Leys is we're putting in smart controls, and smart in this case means internet connected and an internet connected wall thermostat. Now I'm a big skeptical of anybody saying anything connected to the internet is automatically smart. So it's really the internet connection that allows us to do smart things with it, rather than it being smart in its own right. But that is a crucial part of it. We need to be able to analyze what's going on in these properties externally and remotely. And what we're doing is we're optimizing when the heat pump turns on and off to synchronize with the electricity grid. So there are times when electricity is actually quite plentiful and relatively cheap, and there are times where the grid's under strain, everything's struggling, the price goes up, and the carbon intensity actually goes up. So we're operating these heat pumps at a time when the electricity grid can best accommodate it. Now, this is a graph of the price of electricity through averaged over a whole year. It's actually 2017 to 2018, and using a tariff by Octopus Energy called Agile. And you can see there's a peak in the morning, and then there's a really big peak in the afternoon. And the price we're using as a proxy for grid strain is also a proxy for carbon intensity, because when the grid comes under strain, all sorts of higher carbon electricity generating machinery turns on, like gas turbines, etc., get ramped up. So the carbon intensity is quite well correlated with the price, and the strain the grid's under is correlated with the price. So we've chosen to optimize on electricity price, but actually we're getting benefits on both carbon intensity and grid strain. To give you a bit of an idea of how it actually happens, I've picked up 4 half-an-hour segments in the day here, and you can see the price of electricity is there. The grey is the carbon intensity of electricity, and what we're going to do is move the energy that would normally be distributed into the house from these bands out to these different times. So if you're a person that likes to come home at 5 o'clock from work or 5:30 and have your house warm, if you've got a gas system, you might set your boiler to come on at 4 or 4:30 and gradually warm the building up. As we can see, electricity is a lot cheaper here at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So our system will understand that. It will turn your heating on at 1, 2 o'clock, and it may actually get it a little bit warmer than you would normally have. So if you normally like it 21 degrees, it may get it to 22 and then just let it cool down to the perfect temperature as you walk through the door while the electricity price is high. It might say, while electricity is expensive, let it drop down a little bit to 20.5 or even 20 while while you're there, and you know electricity is expensive. And then as soon as you come out of the high price, it'll bring the heat pump back on and turn the temperature up again. And you can do that a little bit in the morning and a little bit in the afternoon. And just the energy that you can store in the fabric of the building, so the walls and the floor and the ceilings, you can move a couple of hours of heat, so 2 to 3 hours worth of heat by 2 to 3 hours. See the grid comes up at 7 p.m. So moving 2 to 3 hours worth of heat is actually really valuable for that mass decarbonisation. And so moving that from 5 in the evening to 2 in the afternoon can be absolutely huge. And in terms of financial savings, the residents can save anything from 25 to 40%. And for the first time, we think we can actually make heat pumps cheaper than mains gas. Ground source competes pretty well with mains gas. In some situations, it can be pretty much cost parity. But by switching over to a variable tariff and doing this load shifting, we can actually get daylight between us and mains gas. We're working on 5 extra properties that we're going to install this year that are going to not just use the fabric of the building. We're actually going to have some local heat storage. So the phase change hot water tanks, we're reconfiguring those to store energy for heating, and we'll be able to shift 2 to 3 hours worth of heat, but not by 2 to 3 hours this time, but by 12 to 18 hours. So we'll be moving them from here in the afternoon, from 5 in the afternoon to 2 in the morning, rather than 5 in the afternoon to 2 in the evening. We get even more benefits then. And that's great for 60 properties in southeast Oxford. But the real benefit is when you come to scaling this up to thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even millions of heat pumps. So the Committee on Climate Change recommends we're installing 1.1 million of these heat pumps per year by 2030, compared to around 25 to 30,000 now. So it's a huge growth. And that is undoubtedly going to affect the electricity grid. But by controlling the heat pumps in a smart way and moving the operation around during the day, there's huge savings that get translated into the grid. It's been estimated if you do this for heating and for transport, then you can save over £100 billion in decarbonising the UK between now and 2050, if you do it in a smart way compared to if you do it in a dumb way. So just to put that in context, you're around 25 to 30 gigawatts. Gigawatts of less electricity generation. So the peak power running through the electricity system, and that's around 30% less than if you decarbonise in a dumb way. So huge benefits onto the electricity grid system. That's the way we're recommending as much as possible low carbon heat to go that route. So hopefully that's given a little bit of a flavour of what we're doing, both in the future and specifically in Oxford. Open up to any questions you might have.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Matt. Thanks for bearing with us through those couple of little dropouts, but I think we caught the whole of it in the end. That's brilliant. I also like the concept of a favourite electricity supplier, maybe not just at the moment, but in the future, perhaps that's maybe where we'll be.
Least unfavourite?
Least unfavourite. So I was just going to suggest if people have some questions they would like to put in the chat box, and then we can invite people to turn on their cameras and their microphones in a minute. I was going to take Chairman's prerogative and just ask a question up front is, what are the expectations on the thermal envelope of the properties themselves? Obviously, with social housing, they tend to have been built to a higher thermal performance in any case because of the things like Code for Sustainable Homes when it was still running. So what are the expectations? Is it just heat a leaky house and bear the extra cost, or is there some fabric first measures that need to go hand in hand?
A little bit of both, depending on the situation. There is an unfortunate myth that a house has to have very high insulation standards in order for a heat pump to work, and that's just blatantly not true. Having said that, any insulation is generally good, and the less energy you need to heat a home, you find us at Kensa encouraging that. Once you get into expensive insulation measures, then it's quite hard to make the case sometimes. So things like loft insulation will always make a case. It should always be done to the recommended standards. Things like cavity wall insulation, exactly the same. Once you start getting into external walls and really expensive ways of treating solid walls, then actually you probably are better off just putting that extra money into what turns it into more ground array. You end up drilling more meters for those leaky properties than you would otherwise. So there is a diminishing return at some point.
Thank you. I mean, that's particularly interesting and relevant to the Oxford sort of solid wall Victorian terrace properties, many of which are, perhaps EPCF or something like that, and will take a lot of work to upgrade them to a very high standard.
I've seen projects where £50,000 worth of extra insulation has knocked £4,000 to £5,000 off the heat pump install. That doesn't seem like the best way of using the limited cash. But
thanks very much indeed for that. So Nick, can I invite you to ask a question then, please?
Thanks very much for the talk. Very interesting indeed. My question is, do you see CO2 heat pumps, which I believe are just starting to come on the market, which can give hotter water, being quite useful, say, for instance, in the Victorian houses in Oxford? They can provide hot enough water, I gather, that you use existing radiator systems. And so you would use more electricity, but you would save on capital cost of refurbishing.
So fair question. I've seen that announcement as well. CO2 is a nice refrigerant in the sense that it's lower global warming potential. So it's better for the environment if it leaked out. So there is some push towards using refrigerants like that. The unfortunate thing about CO2 is it's relatively inefficient compared to the better refrigeration systems that are out there. We're already getting above 65 degrees with our standard refrigeration, and we've not come across a building yet that you can't upgrade the radiators to run at 50 degrees, 55 certainly. So we actually don't think the upgrading of radiators is nearly as big a challenge as is made out. So there are two ways to reduce the temperature that you put into your radiator system. So boilers often run at 70 degrees. As an aside, they need to be running at 55 degrees, otherwise they're not actually condensing boilers. So there's even boilers shouldn't be running at 70, but there you go. If they are running at 70, you can either put insulation on, and your existing radiators can then be run at 50 or 55, or you could change the size of the radiators and they'll run at 50 or 55. Mostly when you change boilers, on average, half the radiators need replacing. So radiators on average last twice as long as a boiler. So for every boiler change, in theory, half the radiators need to be changed anyway. So changing them for the right size, we don't see as a massive problem. In social housing retrofit, we put a whole heating system in a day, including radiators and the heat pump and the new hot water tank. So it's not a bigger challenge as you would imagine. So yeah, personally, I would go that way. We can already make you a heat pump. That means you don't need to change the radiators, but I'd strongly recommend not doing so. Even the heat pumps in Blackbird Lees, we could reprogram to run at high temperatures, but we don't because it's too expensive to run.
Nick, we'll give you a chance to think about that and come back again if you want to. In the meantime, can we move to Aaron? I see you have two questions, and probably they are combined. So could you put that to Matt, please?
Thanks, Matt, for that talk. So there are two questions. One is heat pump users, particularly where it's just like a single heat pump for a house, often told to operate it 24/7. Rather than like having on a timer basis to come on, morning and evening. Could you just clarify why that is the case? Do you know what is it more efficient somehow, or?
I can clarify that it's the case. It's a design philosophy actually. You can design them for either continuous or intermittent use. If you design for intermittent use, then you end up often with a slightly larger heat pump and maybe slightly larger radiators.
Right.
We found the differential cost in doing that is minimal. So our standard at Kensa is designed for intermittent use, so you can turn it on and off like a boiler and not worry about it. There are people that think you can get a slightly higher COP if you just leave it run 24 hours a day, but you've got to balance that with the fact that if your house is slightly warmer, then it's losing more energy 24 hours a day, and what you might have saved in a couple of points higher on the efficiency is outweighed by the extra energy they're basically supplying as heat. So it's not just as straightforward as optimizing COP actually. So I think that's why that's come about, partly through trying to keep the capital cost down, and partly through trying to optimize the COP. Yeah, personally, we've not found that the best way of doing it. Okay.
And the other question, yeah, often heat pump owners, they don't really understand the control system. You know, that they've got a really good heat pump in there, but they're perhaps not using it as best as they could because they don't really understand the controls, or the controls have gone out of sync since it was set up. So just like with the Superhub project, for example, are there any things being put in place so the homeowners can get the best efficiency out of the heat pumps and operate them optimally and get the agile tariff benefits and things like that?
Yeah, two-part question. Everywhere apart from the Energy Superhub project, we normally use off-the-shelf gas controls. So we've had a slightly different philosophy to controls at Kensa, and most of the European controls, they do come in. I've seen heat pumps with those exotic controls. You do need a PhD in electronics just to turn the thing on or get it to come on in the morning, and it is not the most user friendly. So we normally just use a normal, like Honeywell twin channel timer, a normal thermostat. So something that anyone's had a gas boiler will be familiar with. Anyone who's a gas engineer that's turned up, they can turn the heating on and off. They can reprogram it. So that's our normal way of doing things. With Energy Superhub Oxford, it's doing something a little bit special. It's kind of cloud-based computing.
Okay, we've lost Matt for just a second there. So I think the smart controls were an important part of that setup in the Energy Superhub Oxford demonstration.
Hopefully. Yeah. So we're saying off-the-shelf heating controls for the vast majority of our work, but with Oxford, we're actually spending a lot more time with the residents visiting. We get to see in the background exactly what they're doing. We know exactly which properties are warm, which ones are using how much energy. So I've got Amy Featherstone is on the meeting. Regularly comes up every few months and knocks on all the doors and helps make sure they're optimizing it and working. The load shifting is not actually turned on. We finally managed through COVID to get in to meet all the residents and explain to them exactly how to do it. And then the electricity market went completely crazy in the autumn, and the variable price you get from the Octopus Agile turned into a flat rate because they had a cap and it just hit the cap all the time. So we've actually turned the load shifting off temporarily, but hopefully as the market settles down in the spring, it will get turned back on.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for that question. Nick, I'm just going to pass you for a second to go to Anka's question, which follows on, I think, a little in terms of how the automation works when the electricity market is more sensible.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you, Matt, for the presentation. That was super interesting. So I think the first part of my question, you've answered it, because Agile, I think, requires a smart meter. So basically, if customers are on Agile, they would automatically have a smart meter. But yeah, I was just wondering, how much does the customer have to do to get these benefits? How involved do they need to be with the demand side response? Thank you.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. some of them have taken more than a year to get the smart meter installed, and then enables them to get onto Agile, which has been a frustration through this project. The answer for the interaction is very little. So the idea is that we learn that their particular habits or when they like to be warm. So we run the system for a few months without doing the load shifting, and that learns what temperature they like and when. And we kind of get a 7-day picture of their heating needs. And then our system in the cloud goes down, downloads the Agile tariff a day ahead. So that's normally published around 4 p.m. So it downloads that, combines it with the heating needs for the people in that 3 months. We've learned how the property reacts. So we've got a detailed thermal model for each building individually. So even which direction it's facing, whether the windows are on the south side, changes the way the property heats up and cools down. So we take the individual property needs, the occupants' preferences, Agile ahead prices, and then it all puts it into a little bit of a learning algorithm, and it comes up with a new heating profile, which it then sends back to the thermostat. So that happens between 4 p.m. and midnight each day, with day ahead published prices. So the people in the property don't really need to do anything. They've done all of that in that first few months of learning, where we're trying to understand how they use the property and how warm they want to be. So it was a big point when we came into this project that it shouldn't rely on people changing all the time. There's loads of people saying with Agile, you can't plug your car in. They're coming out at 3 in the morning to turn their car on. And there's all sorts of stories about people putting the washing on and trying to set timers on their tumble dryers. We wanted just to make it completely seamless in the background. It's one of the reasons why we chose social housing as well, because while there are half a dozen residents on this project that are unbelievably engaged in energy and climate change, the majority just want to be warm and want to pay less for their heat if they possibly can.
Thank you. Yeah, a project we run in West Oxfordshire, there was one chap who felt heroic because not enough other people had shiftable load, so he'd do exactly that. At 2 o'clock in the morning, when there was a minimum in carbon and everything, he would do everything on behalf of the entire community manually, which I don't think his wife enjoyed at all, I have to say.
Superstar there.
That's right. Can we switch attention to the opposite side of the innovation, the sort of shared loop and so forth? And we got a question from Nick here about that part of the proposition.
Yeah, thanks, Matt, for a great talk, and I agree with you that we seem to be heading into a world where any heat pump with a decent COP is going to have lower running costs than gas. Even when we get through the currently ridiculous price situation. So that the question's relatively straightforward. I'd just say as background, I did work on the last but one government support programme for district heating, and the thing that killed it was capital costs. So what is the? I'm not going to ask you what it's costing you now, because that's doubtless commercially confidential. But what do you think, in a world where we are putting in hundreds of thousands a year of heat pumps? What's a reasonable target for the capital cost for shared loops?
At the moment, it's fair to say that the split ownership networked heat pump utility style model doesn't quite work. So if we were to put the system in and recharge the full cost of that capital back to the householders, their monthly fee would be too high, or annual fee. And that's partly because the cost of things like drilling are more expensive now than we think they will be in the future, by probably double. So we think they'll probably halve as volume comes up. There was around 5,000 ground source heat pumps put in the UK last year. There was 1.6 million gas boilers. So yeah, it doesn't take a huge amount of mass to see the economies of scale playing into that. Drillers tend to travel all over the country. So we've got a project in Plymouth for Marjon University that's being drilled by a drilling team from County Durham at the moment. So once they get to the point where they're only working in a 15-mile radius, then the cost for that side of things will come down dramatically, purely just on transport and accommodation, but on all sorts of other efficiencies as well. The other thing is the cost of money. As I said, the funders don't like to fund anything less than £100 million, or if they do, they charge a hefty great interest rate. So if you combine the higher than we know it will be capital cost with the higher cost of money, that translates into a figure that wouldn't be to homeowners. And then the third element to that is what we're doing in Oxford is to bring down the cost of running the heat pump. So the lower the electricity cost for operating the system, the better able they are to make a contribution towards that capital cost. So yeah, at the moment, the model wouldn't work without government subsidy, but we can see a future when it will. Is that enough, or do you want to get a little bit of specifics on?
You did. Yeah. I didn't hear a number. I mean, the scheme I worked on played out at about £5,000 per dwelling connection cost. That's clearly too much.
There would have been an ongoing cost as well, wouldn't it? So
that was the connection cost. That was the fixed costs of getting onto the system. So equivalent, presumably, to the capital cost of the shared loop. That's why I asked the question that way.
I mean, capital costs for retrofit, they're a little bit more than that. They're probably closer to 20k for if you were doing a whole street for the sort of shared ground arrays. But that would be the shared ground loop, the heat pump, the new heating system. So you have to put in new radiators. That would be a whole system start to finish. In new build, the heat demands are lower and the cost of putting the ground arrays in are less, and you're talking at somewhere between 4 and 6k extra, maybe as much as 8 for putting a system in compared to a mains gas solution. But you can see it's already moving in the right direction for new build.
Yeah, thanks.
Matt, I wonder if you could use a financial model where you build it and then put the cost on everyone's bills up front, because that appears to be one of the methods the nuclear industry is looking to finance its large capital costs in the future. That is kind of where we're recommending we go in some way, shape, or form. And incidentally, if you put ground source in with particularly networked heat pumps and higher temperatures and smart controls, then you can translate that directly into the number of nuclear power stations you don't have to build. So and do a capital cost hurdle rate comparison.
Yeah, it's dozens of nuclear power stations you don't build rather than one.
Apologies to Ian, because he's patiently been waiting while I was asking that little infill question. Ian, are you able to pose your question, please?
Yes, thank you. You explained about how you work with housing associations for a variety of reasons, one of which is it's easier to get the agreement. It's one business you're dealing with. Many air source heat pump suppliers and installers don't like working with standard blocks of flats where there's lots of different owner occupiers. What's your position? Are you also reluctant at this stage to get engaged with that sort of situation?
Shared ground loops lend themselves more to that situation than individual air source, particularly once you go above 3 stories. So we'd be more inclined to, but it is just a cost of sale. It's still a good part of our costs, and those capital costs are the cost of sale and getting everybody lined up in one go. So if a block of flats had a really good tenants association and came to us and said, this is what we're thinking about doing, then that would work for us. If we had to try and market to and educate and bring everybody individually along, that would be a challenge and would put the costs up to not work. So I think it's going to be much more a build it and they will come utility infrastructure side rather than trying to persuade them all to switch over at the same time and the same day.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful because many people do live in separate flats. So it's a challenge at the moment where your utility model does sound very appealing if you can get that financier out of bed to give you the £100 million.
The only special case of that, Ian, is in social housing world. There's often quite a lot of right to buy, so there'll be leaseholders. And the big project we did for Enfield Council, about a quarter, maybe a fifth of the properties were leaseholders. So they opted in, and we were pretty successful getting them. But obviously, you had that base load of the council-owned properties that you knew you were getting at least 70%. So engaging with the other 80%, engaging with the other 20% was relatively straightforward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for all the questions. Can I just ask a final one if we have no others? You talked about 21 centigrade as a target temperature, and over time that's crept up. I remember before central heating, where anything above freezing seemed to be quite a gain. So what is to be won between having, say, an 18 centigrade set point for able-bodied people versus a 21 degrees? Is that a big impact on the operating cost? Do we believe the Energy Saving Trust turn it down a degree guidance?
Yeah, that applies whether it's a gas boiler, oil, electric heating, heat pump, or whatever flavour. Using less energy, the cooler the property is, the less heat is leaking out of it, and the less you'll have to put back in. That's always going to be beneficial. Incidentally, 21 degrees is the new 18, but actually 24 is going to be the new 21 quite often, and we regularly come across situations, particularly sheltered housing, particularly very elderly, where 21 degrees they would be considered they're freezing. So we're often designing to 23. We've had properties that are sitting at 24 degrees, and particularly with internet connected, you can see exactly how warm they are. We've got one in Oxford where 24 actually isn't warm enough for the particular resident, but it's nice because we've got a year's worth of exact temperature data, so we can tweak the design now on that one. As before, it would have been very anecdotal. But now we can see to within 0.1 of a degree how warm she's been for the last 12 months. So
amazing. No, and I do completely understand certain conditions, COPD, sickle cell anemia, etc. Warm temperatures are absolutely vital to give people the health they need. Well, thank you very much.
Message there saying 10% per degree, and I would agree with that. That's about right.
But Nick used to be with the Energy Saving Trust, so you might be just advertising on behalf of them.
It might be, but that figure is pretty close.
That's right.
That's from my colleagues at UCL who run building models, so it's more reliable.
Yeah, don't mean to disparage at all. Well, Matt, thank you very much for dealing with a range of questions. Food for thought for me, particularly the idea that heat pumps can still participate in some significant shift in demand. I mean, obviously the interseasonal element in terms of pumping heat back into the ground, but also the diurnal as well. So thank you very much indeed for that. I'm just going to do a quick advert for our next seminar now. And thanks again, Matt, for a fantastic talk.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Good to meet you all.
So small hiccup, our next seminar will be in a fortnight now. It's going to be the 8th of February, and we'll be welcoming Julian Cooper, Head of Energy Policy at Citizens Advice. So Julian leads the organisation's advocacy work because they're the statutory energy consumer advocate. And she'll be talking about how to build a more resilient energy market and the challenges of supporting households, both short and medium term. No small ask there, and how to continue to develop policy frameworks needed to support the transition to net zero. So, as I say, I'll be very interested to hear the consumer perspective on that, but that will be in a fortnight's time. Hoping that the anticipated changes to university guidance will enable us to do that with some of you in person, but we'll have to keep an eye open on that. Please sign up for the newsletter if you don't really get it, because we send out on a Monday the weekly links to seminars and also the link to the recordings and slides from the previous week. Also look out for more details of the Oxford Energy Day on the 23rd of March, which is about delivering net zero. Clearly it's mainly for members of the University of Oxford, but we'll be very pleased to invite others into that. The link's probably not going to come out for another few weeks yet, and we'll have a full dynamic programme to offer to you. So thank you all again for joining, and I hope you have a good evening.